It began not on the beaches, but in silence, behind locked doors, deep inside London's war offices. The greatest invasion in human history was being born, in whispers, on maps, and through sleepless nights. This was the birth of D-Day, an operation so massive, so secret, that even those involved didn't fully understand what they were part of. June 1944, the Allies had one mission: to break Hitler's grip on Europe. But how do you invade a fortress? How do you cross a sea, surprise the enemy, and change the course of the world? The answer began 2 years earlier. In 1942, while bombs still fell over Britain, Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt began shaping an idea, the idea that would liberate an entire continent. They called it Operation Overlord. Its goal was simple: free France from Nazi occupation and open a new front to crush Germany from the west. But making it happen was anything but simple. Inside a hidden command center in London, British and American generals studied the French coastline day and night. Normandy, Pas-de-Calais, Brittany. Each region analyzed, every beach measured, every tide recorded. The Germans had turned Europe's western shore into a fortress, a deadly barrier they called the Atlantic Wall. Mines, bunkers, machine guns, and endless concrete. To attack it head-on was suicide unless the enemy could be fooled, and that's exactly what the Allies planned to do. Men like General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Bernard Montgomery, and Admiral Bertram Ramsay spent months shaping a plan of deception and destruction, a plan so large it would require over 150,000 soldiers, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft. Every single detail mattered: the tides, the moonlight, even the exact hour of the assault. If one thing went wrong, if one plan leaked, the entire operation could collapse before it began. So, secrecy became their weapon. By late 1943, almost no one knew the full plan. Even soldiers preparing for the invasion didn't know where they were going. Code names were everywhere: Overlord, Neptune, Omaha, Utah. Letters home were censored. Maps were hidden. And anyone caught talking about the invasion faced prison. The Allies built fake armies, fake radio messages, even fake airfields to mislead German spies. They wanted Hitler to believe the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the closest point to England, not Normandy. This deception would become one of the greatest in history. But in those early months, nothing was guaranteed. The planners worked through the night. Cigarette smoke filled the air. Coffee cups piled high beside maps covered in pins, red strings, and the words, "Top Secret." They knew what was at stake. If D-Day failed, Europe would remain under Nazi control for decades. If it succeeded, it would mark the beginning of the end. So they worked in silence, guided by duty and hope. Every document locked away, every decision weighed against the cost of human life. Every man and woman in those rooms understood the fate of the world rested on their secrecy. While the public slept, while bombs fell over London, the silent architects of D-Day continued their unseen war. It wasn't fought with bullets or bombs, but with ideas, maps, and trust. It was a war of patience, a war of minds, a war of faith. And as the winter of 1943 turned to spring, the pieces began to align. The deception, the armies, the plan, the destiny. The invasion of Normandy was coming, and when it arrived, the world would never be the same again. This was the calm before the storm. The invasion wasn't born in battle. It was born in shadows, in the quiet resolve of those who dared to dream of freedom. Before we continue to the deception, the spies, and the secret war that fooled Hitler himself, make sure you subscribe to War Stories History, because the next part will reveal how a phantom army and a web of lies turned the tide of World War II. Before the first soldier stepped onto Normandy's sands, the Allies fought a different kind of war, a war of illusion. It was called Operation Fortitude, and it became one of the most brilliant deceptions in military history. The goal was simple: make Hitler believe the invasion would strike anywhere but Normandy. The reality? It would strike right there. But to pull off the illusion, every piece had to be perfect. In southern England, an army was built, but not a real one. Tanks made of rubber, aircraft carved from wood, campfires without soldiers, radio messages buzzing through empty airfields. This was the first U.S. Army group, a phantom force under the legendary General George S. Patton, a man Hitler both feared and respected. The Allies knew the Germans believed Patton was their most dangerous commander, so they turned him into a weapon of deception. Patton's army existed only on paper and in the skies, a masterpiece of fake intelligence radio chatter, and staged reconnaissance. From German spies' eyes in France it looked real. Thousands of vehicles, dozens of divisions, all pointed toward Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between England and France, and Hitler bought it completely. German reconnaissance flights captured photographs of dummy tanks lined up in perfect rows. Intercepted Allied communications mentioned Calais again and again. It was enough to convince the Führer that Normandy was just a diversion. While the real invasion force trained quietly along England's southern coast, the fake army drew every German eye northward. Fortitude wasn't just a plan, it was theater. And the world's greatest actor was war itself. British intelligence added another layer: double agents, men and women who pretended to serve Hitler while secretly feeding him lies. The most famous was a Spaniard known as Garbo. Through fake reports and coded letters, Garbo convinced the Germans that the true invasion would come weeks after the Normandy landings, and that the first assault was merely a distraction, even when Allied troops stormed the beaches on June 6, 1944. Hitler still believed the real attack was yet to come. He refused to release his reserve forces for over a week, and that hesitation would cost him everything. Fortitude worked because it played on the enemy's greatest weakness: certainty. The Germans were certain they knew where the Allies would land. They were certain Normandy was too far, too weakly supplied, too unpredictable. But war, as always, belongs to those who dare to do the impossible. In London, behind locked doors, the masterminds of deception watched their plan unfold. Every intercepted German message was a victory. Every day Hitler delayed his response was another step toward success. For months they had fed lies into the Nazi intelligence machine, and now the lies had become truth. The illusion was complete, but behind the brilliance of Fortitude lay a heavy burden, because every false move meant real lives at risk. If the deception failed, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers would be slaughtered before ever reaching the shore. The planners knew it. The agents knew it. And still, they carried on. By May 1944, the deception had reached its climax. German generals were so convinced that Calais was the target, they fortified it with their best units, leaving Normandy dangerously underdefended. The stage was set. The curtain was about to rise, and 150,000 men were preparing to step into history. As the sun set on June 5th, the deception had done its job. German eyes looked north to Calais. But the true storm gathered south, in the dark waters of the English Channel. Men waited in silence aboard their landing craft. Engines rumbled softly under the waves. Prayers were whispered. Letters were sealed, and hearts beat like drums against the steel hulls. The greatest secret in the world had been kept. The greatest invasion in history was only hours away. Operation Fortitude had set the stage. Now it was time to face the fire. The illusion was over. The storm was about to begin. Make sure you're subscribed to War Stories History, because in the next part, we'll take you into the chaos of D-Day itself, where courage met hell and the fate of the world hung by a thread. June 6, 1944. D-Day, the world's greatest gamble, had begun. At 6:30 in the morning, the first wave of Allied soldiers hit the beaches of Normandy. But before the sun even rose, the invasion had already started. In the skies above and the waters below, just after midnight, thousands of paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions leapt into darkness over occupied France. The wind roared past their helmets. Tracer fire ripped through the night sky. Men scattered miles off course, some landing in flooded fields, others right in the arms of the enemy. Yet despite chaos, they fought. They cut communication lines, seized bridges, and sowed confusion among German defenders. Every gun they silenced, every road they blocked, made it easier for the men who would storm the beaches hours later. Then came the thunder. At dawn, an armada of more than 5,000 ships stretched across the horizon, the largest invasion fleet in history. The sea itself seemed alive, roaring with the engines of war. From battleships and destroyers, Allied guns opened fire on the French coast. Shells screamed through the air, smashing bunkers, tearing apart fortifications, shaking the earth for miles. The sky burned red with fire and smoke. And behind that storm came the men: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, 5 beaches, 5 gateways to freedom. On the western flank, American troops landed at Utah Beach, battered by strong currents but met with lighter resistance. They fought through dunes and flooded fields, pushing inland toward their airborne comrades. The plan for them was working, but just a few miles east. On Omaha Beach it was hell. The tides ran high. The currents dragged men off course. When the landing craft doors opened, machine gun fire tore through them like rain. Bodies fell into the surf. Boats burned. Smoke covered the sea. The men of the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were pinned down. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. For hours they were slaughtered on the sand, and yet they refused to break. Small groups began crawling forward, inch by inch, using bomb craters for cover. Engineers cleared mines under fire. Snipers took out German positions one by one. By sheer determination, they began to push inland. It was said that on Omaha Beach, courage was measured in inches and paid for in blood. Meanwhile, British and Canadian forces stormed Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches to the east. They fought through heavy resistance, machine gun nests, and artillery fire. Tanks rolled ashore, some sinking before they reached land, others breaking through enemy lines. By mid-afternoon, the beaches were secured. The price? Over 10,000 casualties in just one day. But the impossible had been done. The Germans had been caught off guard. Hitler, convinced it was still a diversion, refused to send reinforcements, and that delay, that single fatal hesitation, gave the Allies their foothold in Europe. The men on those beaches didn't see victory. They saw chaos. They saw friends dying beside them. They saw the waves stained red. But in that chaos, in that terror, they created something eternal, hope. They didn't fight for glory. They fought so that others could live free. As night fell over Normandy, the beaches were littered with wreckage, broken tanks, twisted steel, and fallen heroes. But behind that destruction stood a truth the world would never forget. The tide had turned. D-Day was more than an invasion. It was a message that tyranny could be fought, that darkness could be broken, and that freedom, no matter the cost, was worth dying for. The gates to Europe were open. But the war was far from over. Ahead lay the hedgerows of Normandy, the battle for France, and the march toward Berlin. Day had begun the end. But before the final victory, there would still be months of blood and sacrifice. Stay with us, because in the final part, we'll take you beyond the beaches into the brutal fight for Normandy itself and the dawn of liberation. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to War Stories History, where the voices of the past live on, and the stories of courage are never forgotten. The beaches of Normandy were won, but the battle for France was only beginning. June 7, 1944. As dawn broke over the smoking shores, the true challenge emerged, pushing inland. The Allies had landed. Now they had to survive. Behind the beaches lay a nightmare of hedgerows, miles of tangled earth, trees, and stone walls that turned every field into a fortress. The German army knew this terrain. They had dug in, hidden tanks behind the brush, and turned every road into a trap. For the soldiers who had survived D-Day, the next phase was even deadlier. They called it the Battle for Normandy. It wasn't fast. It wasn't glorious. It was fought inch by inch in the mud, under the constant thunder of artillery. The air smelled of smoke and wet soil. The sky was never quiet. Snipers lurked behind every shadow. Mortars screamed from hidden positions, and the ground trembled under tank fire. The Allies, Americans, British, Canadians, and Free French pressed forward, one village at a time. Names like Carentan, Caen, and Saint-Lô became symbols of courage and sacrifice. At Caen, the British and Canadians fought for weeks in brutal urban combat, facing some of Germany's most elite SS Panzer divisions. At Saint-Lô, American troops battled through narrow lanes turned into death traps by mines and machine guns. Each town was reduced to rubble. Each victory was paid for in blood. But slowly, the German lines began to break. The Allied air forces dominated the skies, bombing enemy convoys, cutting supply lines, and shattering reinforcements before they could reach the front. By July, the enemy was running out of fuel, ammunition, and hope. Then came the decisive blow. Operation Cobra. Led by General Omar Bradley, the Americans unleashed a massive air assault south of Saint-Lô. The earth shook as thousands of bombs rained down, obliterating German defenses. When the smoke cleared, Allied tanks roared through the breach. The German army began to collapse. Trapped in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket, tens of thousands were surrounded. The sky turned black with smoke, the fields littered with burning vehicles. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi control in France. By August 25, 1944, after nearly 3 months of relentless fighting, the Allies entered Paris. The City of Lights, once shrouded in darkness, was free again. Crowds filled the streets, tears mixed with cheers as the French resistance waved their flags and embraced the soldiers who had given them back their freedom. And though victory filled the air, the cost was unimaginable. Over 200,000 Allied casualties and countless civilians lost. Each hill, each village, each stone of Normandy had been bought with sacrifice, but through their pain, a new dawn rose over Europe. The Nazi Empire was crumbling, and from the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Paris, one truth echoed louder than any bomb: freedom had returned. The Battle of Normandy wasn't just a military triumph. It was a testament to courage, unity, and unbreakable will. It proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, hope could still prevail. Every soldier who fought there, every soul who fell, became part of a legacy that would live forever. The men of D-Day didn't just change history, they saved it. And as the world rebuilt itself from the ashes, the memory of those who stormed the beaches, crossed the fields, and freed the towns of Normandy remained eternal. Today, when you walk the beaches of France, you can still see the scars, the bunkers, the bullet holes, the silent monuments to those who never came home. They remind us that freedom isn't given. It's earned money by those brave enough to fight for it. So remember their story. Honor their sacrifice. And never forget the price that was paid for peace. This was D-Day, the invasion that changed the world, the battle that defined a generation, and the beginning of the end of tyranny. If you felt the power of this story, make sure you subscribe to War Stories History, because here we bring the voices of the past to life so their courage will never be forgotten.